Rock Tech Lithium used to be an explorer for lithium and is now getting into the stage of developing a property into lithium production. We have our core property in Canada, right next to the Great Lakes, so we are centrally located. It used to be an historic property. There was a lot of information of the 50s, and we restarted this project in 2010. Started with some drilling, had a lot of work on this, etc., etc., and it was a difficult time for all metals businesses and especially also for lithium until beginning of 2016. And beginning of 2016, we intensified all our work on the property, and we have now our first economic study on the property, and we know that we can produce lithium. We know that we can do this economically viable, and yeah, therefore we are very, very happy to be in this exciting market that is now growing, especially because of the electromobility. Yes, we just finalized our preliminary economic assessment. We published news releases on this, and very soon we will publish on our webpage then the final report. And you will see when people hear about this, about preliminary economic assessment, you will see that there are different qualities of this kind of study. Later on, when you're in a feasibility study, you have very much a standardized quality of this. In the preliminary economic assessment, you have some who are taking this in a rather light way, and you have some companies that are like us, who have already this PEA in a very serious way with a lot of detailed information to understand how do you get the lithium, the material out of the ground, how much will it cost, with whom do you work, how much equipment do you need, etc. What we did so far is that we approached it in a very pragmatic way. I have to say this first, because normally when you're in an exploration status, the companies try to do as much drilling as possible, which costs a lot of money to show a property and a resource that is as large as possible. We did it slightly different because we have a large property and we see a lot of pegmatite outcrops on the surface already. So we know that there's a lot of lithium pegmatites available. And we focused our drilling, first of all, on a main zone, which is just a part of our old property. And we did it in a way that we said we only do as much exploration that we know we have enough material to bring this into production, and then you produce successfully, and with the profits out of this production, you do the further exploration work. I'm saying this because the outcome means it's not for the overall property, it's just for the start and for the main zone that we are getting started with. And we were focusing on having an initial mine life of minimum 10 years. So this was the area we were looking for, which overall will expand then probably to 20 or whatever years. And for this first 10 years, we will have an NPV before tax of above 300 million Canadian dollars, which is more or less 9 times our current market cap, and which shows a lot of development potential for our company. The PEA does underestimate the potential size of the project, but for us as a management that is focused on shareholder value, we don't consider this to be a problem because we are setting up the right-sized plant, and the difference over time will be that we always assume the same annual production of material, which will mostly be at the beginning spodumene concentrate. And the additional exploration work that we are getting into when we are having our first positive cash flows will then increase the life of the mine to a longer period of probably up to 20 or even more years. But it makes sense to go step by step because this is the most efficient way also to avoid all the dilutions that you usually have at early stages of an exploration work. Currently, the answer is yes. Well, the risks on the one hand is, of course, the market, so the market price for lithium. And the second risk is, of course, we still need 2 years until we start production. As a development manager, you have to be honest, there are always issues that could theoretically come up during these 2 years. There's still some environmental testing that we are doing, etc., etc. We have done quite some work on things, so we don't expect any challenges in the next 2 years. But that is usually for a development company that goes into production over time, the biggest challenge. And the first point that I mentioned, which is market price of lithium, this is something where we are, I have to say, pretty optimistic. So the current sales prices are much, much higher than our production costs. And we don't see any reason that the lithium price should come down, as we are seeing, especially in China, but now also in Europe, that the distribution, the sales of electric vehicles are increasing constantly with a very high speed. As a classical exploration company and an exploration status, you usually try to have several properties available. Now we are not a usual company, because we knew, because of the historic data that was available to us, that we have a pretty good property at Georgia Lake. So our main focus was always and still is the Georgia Lake property. However, when we are looking into the market of electric vehicles and of use of battery storage, not only for cars and trucks, but also in the power grid systems, we see a market in front of us that will probably grow during the next 40, 50 years. So we said that we expect that our Georgia Lake property will be great, most likely for up to 20 years. But in the long haul, and you need to think sometimes in the long haul to develop a property accordingly, we are also interested then to fill up with additional properties. And Nogalito is a first step in this direction, which is a brine deposit, so a different structure of deposit, which is still early stage. So we consider this as an optionality that we continue to work on, where we also have historic drill data available already, and that in the perfect world, we are bringing a project such as Nogalito in production towards the end of the production time of our Georgia Lake property. Currently, we are just looking into the first step. We have a hard rock property that is based on spodumene structures. So whatever you are deciding what the final product will be, we are starting to produce spodumene concentrate, which then concentrates the lithium content, the lithium oxide content that we have in the ground of about 1% to 6%. So this 6% spodumene concentrate is something that at the moment, mostly in China, they are so-called converters who produce a 99.95% carbonate or hydroxide out of this spodumene concentrate. So currently, the planning in our PEA, the assumption is that we are producing the spodumene concentrate and shipping it, like the Australian producers are currently doing it, to China or to another converter that might also well be in North America. But in the next 2 years, we might well decide to push some consolidation processes also in terms of properties, hard rock properties in Canada and in the region, and decide to get into lithium hydroxide production ourselves. The trend in the industry currently is to produce lithium hydroxide instead of carbonate, because hydroxide can be used to create a higher energy density in the final battery chemistry. Well, it is a very interesting point, and of course sometimes frustrating when you look at a market that is constantly growing, but when you see that the challenges are that most likely not all market participants understand the current facts and realities. So we had in the year 2017 probably something like a hype in the field of battery metals. Lithium shares were increasing in their prices, cobalt shares, etc., etc. Maybe this was overdone because the fact at that time was that every share price of a company that was in this field started to explode. This is never justified. When you have 200 explorers, you might have, when you're lucky, 10, maybe 15 out of those who eventually go into production. So it's never the right thing when the full industry goes up. What we saw then as reaction is that since beginning of 2018, the share prices went down. And also here in the downward trend, there was the investors made no difference between the quality producers. Let's not talk about us. Let's only talk first of all about the real producers. Companies that are generating a very high cash flow, big international groups, all their share prices went down by 50%. And this is not reasonable if you believe that the lithium demand market will grow as it is currently mostly forecasted, for example, by Bloomberg, who's doing a great job on this kind of forecast. We had a situation in February and March 2018 where some banks such as Morgan Stanley came with their analysis, and this was rather bearish. And the argumentation was that the demand will be limited. They were arguing with around 8 million full electric vehicles in the year 2025. This is a sort of standard year that is used by these by the analysts. And at the same time, they said that the supply will increase constantly because it's rather simple to increase supply from all these salars in Latin America. Both assumptions are, in our point of view, completely wrong. On the one hand, for the demand side, we see already now, when you add all the announcements alone of the Chinese market, you will see that the Chinese producers are going to sell up to 15 million electric vehicles in the year 2025, compared to the 8 million figure I said before of the analysts. And this is only China. In Europe, you look at announcements currently, you can hear on my accent that I'm German. You look at the announcements of all the German car producers. So VW, Audi, Mercedes-Benz, BMW, etc. And then you can add another 3 to 4 million vehicles. So the numbers, the reality in a few years will be minimum double of what the analysts forecasted earlier this year. And on the supply side, you just need to follow the news. Lithium is a very complex product. You have a very small concentration in these salars, in these brine deposits in Argentina and Chile and Bolivia, and it is challenging to simply increase this production. So these supply assumptions that the analysts had early this year are probably challenging to be fulfilled. But even if, as long as the demand side is growing as we are expecting it, and this is what all actual figures are showing, we will be very fine. And you see that analysts are currently changing their views, and that this bearish situation from the analyst side is getting out of the market. Unfortunately, the investors haven't seen this yet, but this is a matter of a few months, and in our point of view, that more reality will get back into the market. I think that it's very difficult to understand the lithium market. So it might well be, you need a lot of time to be in this. This market is not really transparent. You're working with many assumptions. Assumptions on the demand side, on the way forward, how many cars are being sold. Will lithium batteries be used in trucks in the future? Will it be used for the grid storage, etc.? So the demand side, first of all, is very difficult to forecast. The supply side is even more difficult to forecast. Even as an analyst, how can you really judge if a project is good enough to go into production or not? You just listen usually to statements of management teams who believe in their projects, but as I said before, in the reality, only a few projects can really go into production. And if the analysts have other interests in this, it's difficult to say. We are at the early stage of a huge developing market. So the growth rates for lithium products will be around 18% per year, compounded annual growth rate. This is the highest growth rate that was ever there for any kind of metal. And this is a new market that is still at an early stage, and who knows what other ideas the banks have to get involved in this sooner or later themselves.